We're going to Manchester. The latest from Podnews.net with CBC Podcasts, looking for their next podcast hit. We start with some news of our own today. Podnews is to launch a series of local day-long conferences, starting with Podnews Live North, an event on June the 13th at the Lowry Centre in Salford in Greater Manchester in the UK. Among the speakers will be Sophie Hind from VoiceWorks, Ian Forrester from BBC R&D, Kate Cocker from Everyday Positivity, and our editor, that's me. Built to help those in the business of podcasting effectively network, tickets are now on sale and a further event is planned in London the day before the British Podcast Awards. In Australia, the IAB has revealed that podcast advertising spend in the country was 82 million Australian dollars. That's 55 million American in 2022. Overall, the online ad market saw a growth of 15% in the first 6 months and 4% growth in the second half of the year. Headliner has a fancy new website. You can see that at headliner.app. Earbuds looks at 5 podcasts containing great writing for the ear. It's curated by the writers and producers of NPR's White Lies. And also in further reading in Techta, Mike Masnick writes about the flop of Spotify's podcast colonization. James Burt suggests that new shows perform better in Apple's ranking algorithm. And Jordan Harbinger shares at least 18 podcast marketing tips in Podcast Marketing Magic. And YouTube podcasts. The Hollywood Reporter was present at the HotPod Summit last week and the YouTube Music announcement. We linked to that. So we linked to Axios, who said the mood was upbeat. Andrew Scott, though, calls the announcement confusing, asking how the ad-funded background listening is going to work for podcasters. And in emails to Podnews, I only think this will work if the podcasts are available both on YouTube and YouTube Music simultaneously, says Anthony Frazier, adding, I'm not sure if that was clarified. Our podcast playlist, at least, appears visible on YouTube as well. Upsetting it's US only at the moment, says a Canadian reader, echoing our thoughts. And they add, they are totally fumbling a massive opportunity. It's a Monday, so time for some tech stuff. In a Facebook post, Todd Cochran reveals that Blueberry podcasters have already earned $625 from Value for Value in the first 3 weeks of the company's support. Considering it takes time to train audiences on Value for Value, he says this is pretty incredible. Which reminds me, this podcast has Value for Value enabled, and I would really appreciate it if you get value out of this podcast if you'd hit that boost button and send me a message. That would be super kind of you. And if you don't have a fancy podcast app which has a boost button, then go get a better one like Fountain, which has produced a beginner's guide to Value for Value on Fountain video. You'll find that linked today. And a transcript search app has been built using the transcript tags in the new podcast namespace too. And in podcast news, Normal Gossip announced last week that the podcast is to join Radiotopia from PRX. The show returns on April the 5th. Slow Burn has announced that Season 8, coming in May, will focus on the life and career of Justice Clarence Thomas, who is the oldest member of the US Supreme Court. Next Year in Moscow is new from The Economist, hosted by the newspaper's Russian editor Arkady Ostrovsky, who travels across Europe and the Middle East to speak to free-thinking Russians who fled their country after last year's invasion. As they continue to rebuild their lives, Ostrovsky asks them if they'll ever return to Russia. If you like business wars, a new podcast, Empires, is similar but set within Asia, featuring conglomerates like Sony or unicorns turned monopolies like Tencent. From triumph and victories to monumental failures, Empire gets you behind the scenes of Asia's most successful businesses. It's new from One Up Media. And from the BBC World Service, Dear Daughter returns for a second season today. Last year, it was crowned Podcast of the Year at the British Podcast Awards. The host, Namalanta Combo, won the first international podcast competition run by the BBC. This podcast is sponsored by CBC Podcasts. CBC Podcasts is looking for its next premium quality narrative podcast series. If you've got a story or partnership to pitch to CBC Podcasts, then check out cbc.ca/pitch. That's cbc.ca/pitch. And that's the latest from our newsletter. To read all the stories and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.